to have a couple short speeches here before we
started in Central America. So we gotta stand
Venezuela! Hands up! 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 Venezuela!
Of the forced changeover of governments in Venezuela. What are your comments about our involvement in this?
It's horrific. It's almost like we're back at the days of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 when the U.S. said it could do anything in its own backyard. And unfortunately, most of the European countries are going along with this, which is just a strange circumstance where you have, quote, democratic countries that are supporting the most undemocratic moves of putting somebody in power, Juan Guaido, who was never elected president by anybody, not one person in Venezuela. There is a path that this is leading to, which is a civil war in Venezuela. And the U.S. is trying very hard to not only empower the opposition, but to divide the military. And that's going to mean brother against brother, sister against sister, and possibly even the U.S. and Russia intervening. It could be in Venezuela what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. And that tragedy should not be allowed to happen. The other option is a negotiated solution like Mexico and Uruguay and the Pope and others are calling for. That's what we need.
We saw the same type of action taking place in Argentina in 1953, in Chile, Honduras more recently in another decade, a couple decades later. Is this anything similar to that, in your opinion?
You know, this is very similar, but it's even worse because Venezuela is such a large country, and because so many people would be affected, and because the economic crisis is so severe already that this is going to make it so much worse. If people are concerned about the flood of refugees to neighboring countries, imagine the flood of refugees once a civil war breaks out in Venezuela.
Hands up, Venezuela! Hands up, Venezuela! Hands up, Venezuela! Hands up, Venezuela!
If you believe as you say you do, and as Trump and Pompeo and John Bolton, don't laugh, say they do, that they believe in the rule of law, the rule of law is clearly on the side of the legitimate constitutional government in Venezuela, which was elected by its people, which is represented at the United Nations, and even on that sort of mainstream legal argument, the Trump administration is in clear violation of all international laws, international norms, and as such should be condemned. We can turn back the propaganda and the demonization. This is the beginning. It is the beginning. It's not going to stop until one side or the other wins. So we have to go at it. We have to learn how to be persuasive. We have to be determined. And most importantly, we have to be resolved not to capitulate to the imperial demonization of the target in this case. And that, of course, is the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan people, and those who are fighting for social justice in that country. Thank you very much.
which is that the coup itself is illegal under international law. There's no basis for it in Venezuela. The Venezuelan election was legitimate and it was boycotted by the opposition, so the U.S. decided to say, well, it's illegitimate. And the opposition has pursued a strategy of violence and rejection of Venezuela's democratic institutions. Now we need to talk about what the opposition wants. I mentioned the National Assembly. One of its final moves before it was dissolved in 2017 was to pass the transition law. And the transition law laid out its agenda for when it came into power on the backs of, I don't know, a Colombian invasion with U.S. air power. I don't know how they're going to ride into power. Their agenda was mass privatization, privatizing PDVSA, the state oil company, and handing state assets over to the oligarchs that they represent. That's their open agenda. And that is the agenda of Juan, what's his name, who was educated here, by the way, at the Imperial training ground of George Washington University, and then went to grad school in Venezuela at a place set up by the Chicago boys. So we know what he's about. And what has he done since he's been in power, but no one can find out where he is. Since he's been in power on Wikipedia, what has he done? He has called for a massive IMF loan and for privatizing the state oil company. That's his first declaration. So I don't even know who in Venezuela is willing to march for that.
Real democracy. So when they say that there's no democracy in Venezuela, I have to laugh because they have a democracy there like we've never seen before. The Constituent Assembly has reserved seats for women, for pensioners, for LGBTQ people, for indigenous people, for disabled people. You know, so there is a purposeful cross-section of society represented in the drafting of a new constitution that's going to set the framework for this country. There were no indigenous people in the United States who were involved in drafting the constitution here. Certainly no indigenous people, no black people, no LGBTQ people. Nobody was involved in creating that. So, right on its face, it's much more democratic. But even the elections that happened last May, in which Maduro was elected, re-elected, he was elected on. These are the elections that we already talked about. That the Carter Center said were, and I quote, the best in the world. And you know, international observers have all said this was a free and fair election that the opposition just didn't show up for. And it's kind of funny that they say that Maduro's attacking the opposition, shutting down the opposition. What about how the U.S. shuts down the opposition here? Think about in 2016 how, or the lead up to the 2016 election, how opposition candidates like Jill Stein weren't even allowed to participate in the presidential debates. Jill Stein was arrested trying to get into one of the debates. How is that not shutting down opposition? There's no real alternative between the Democrats and the Republicans. So how is that not shutting down opposition? You know? And you know, so 2/3 of the people who participated in the May 2018 elections voted for Maduro, which is just an enormous margin. And you know, 46% of Venezuelans participated in the registered Venezuelans who can vote participated in the elections, and they said, oh, well, this is the lowest turnout ever they had, so therefore these are illegitimate. But like, I mean, does anybody know what the turnout for the 2016 election was in the United States? It was about 54% of registered voters. So 54 versus 46. So I don't know where the drawing line is that makes one election legitimate and the other one illegitimate.
Because absent facts, absent actual knowledge of what's going on in Venezuela, what people basically rely on is the corporate-owned media. Even people who always say, don't believe the corporate-owned media, are still influenced by the corporate-owned media. And they always say, don't forget what the corporate-owned media told us about Iraq in 2003. Never forget that until the next crisis comes around and the corporate-owned media uses the same tools of demonization against the next target, and a big part of the population falls in line, including people who say they're progressive, including some people who even say they're socialists. And it's a reminder that the ideas of society are molded by those who have power, and they use the media or religious institutions or academia to shape and mold opinions so they conform to the dominant narrative of the ruling class. This is not a new concept. Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, the ideas of any society are the ideas of its ruling class. Now that doesn't mean that's always true, because if that was always true, there would be no possibility of change. I'm talking about at the beginning of a crisis, the ideas of society are more or less molded by the ruling dominant narrative. And Eugene's factual presentation and that's been offered by the other speakers here, which is factual. It's factual about what's going on in Venezuela. Or as Medea put it, also, you may not have to agree with the Maduro government to recognize the fact that the United States has no legal basis, certainly no ethical or political or moral basis, but no legal basis to tell Venezuela who their government will be.